Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey. I am Rob, your host, and we are going to have a fun conversation today. My guest, Bob Paulinski, Master of Wine, is joining the show. Bob, thanks so much for coming on.
Rob, it's great to be here. Thank you.
This is a real treat for me. I've had a lot of wine guests on, but never a master of wine. And I'm looking forward to getting into that title, kind of what it encompasses, what it means, what it took to get there. And I think a lot of my listeners are interested in that as well. So this should be a fun conversation, as well as diving into some other topics in the wine world. And not to mention, we're going to talk a little bit about your YouTube channel. You're on YouTube as well. And that's kind of where I found you. But first, tell the folks a little bit about you, who you are, kind of, obviously I said master of wine, but your journey in wine. Everybody kind of has this story of how they got into wine. And I always ask the question, and people might think it's a little boring, but it's always different for everybody. Everybody has a little different twist or different journey on where the love and the passion for wine kind of came from. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, of course. First off, you're setting the bar high for me, so I'm feeling a little stressed.
Don't.
Uh, no, I think for a good number of people, they have some sort of aha moment. They visit some place or they try some wine that just opens their eyes, and all of a sudden they're hooked on wine. Uh, that's not the case for me at all. Mine is actually somewhat the opposite of that. Uh, when I was a kid, teenager, I landed a job in a wine shop, and I was a kid who was going to stock the shelves, and I drove a truck, and helped ladies out with their packages and that sort of thing. And there was an older gentleman there who was semi-retired, and we hit things off. He was a nice guy. He treated me well, and he kind of took me under his wing a little bit. And one night, he was having a late night supper, which he always did after this wine shop closed. And I'm in the storage room moving boxes around, and he called me Polish boy. So he said, "Polish boy, come here. I've got something for you." And he had a bottle of wine open, and he said, "Here, I want you to try this." And here I am, you know, 17, 18-year-old kid. It's like, wow, I can actually have some wine at work. That's kind of fun. And I tasted this wine and I nearly retched. And he just burst out laughing. And he said, "I'm going to give you a book." And the book was called the Alexis Lichine Encyclopedia of Wine, which back in its day was like the gold standard reference book. And he gave me this book and said, "Go home, read about this. We'll talk about it tomorrow." And I took the book home. I wasn't too happy about having to taste this god awful wine, but I read about not only the wine that we tasted, but some just wine in general. And as a kid, this just struck me as fascinating. There was a business aspect. There was an aspect of politics and religion and art and science and a culinary piece. It involved all these different places around the world that I could only dream of maybe visiting someday. And that was like the aha moment for me. But then I spent the next 4 years with this guy tasting wines and getting to know the classics. So we would spend a month and he'd say, "Okay, this month we're only going to taste the wines from Tuscany." And it built a foundation for me. And then I had this harebrained idea in my early 20s. When I was 23, I opened my own wine store. Uh, Not enough cash in my pocket and not enough knowledge, but had a world of enthusiasm. And I had that store for almost 20 years.
Well,
So,
that got you into wine, but you weren't just a wine. So tell me the story of going from, owning a store and then getting into uh, the education part of wine. I mean, learning, because we see your title, Master of Wine, and a lot of folks are like, okay, how do you get there? What does that mean? What's the journey to become a Master of Wine? And I think some people don't
mm,
know the correlation or the connection between the Master of Wine program and the W set. I think for a long time,
yeah.
Master of Somm had all the kind of, everybody knew it, I think, a lot because of the show that was on Netflix. But the W
Oh, of
set is
course.
also an outstanding wine education program.
Yeah, all of this becomes a little bit convoluted. So for me, I had an interest in learning about wine to the nth degree. It was just something that struck me as appealing, and I went really deep into it. So this is back in the day where wasn't spending a lot of time on the internet. This was you had books. And if you wanted to talk to a winemaker on the other side of the world, well, you got up in the middle of the night, or you sent a fax, or whatever it is that you did back then. But the MW is something that caught my attention uh, when it first started to have some presence in the U.S. So just to give you a little bit of background, the MW program as an entity came into existence in 1953, and its origins tie back to London. And I think for a good number of people, you think, London, what does that have to do with wine? Well, for the longest time, that's really been the financial hub or the economic hub for the wine world, and still is today to a large extent. So the program began in the 50s in London. And the way that I became aware of it was an article that was in some magazine years ago, which my ex-wife found. And now she's not my ex because of the MW program, by the way. But she showed me this article, and she said, I think this would be something worth pursuing. And I did a little research, and I thought, this looks interesting because I have a store. At this point, I had a retail shop for a number of years, and the store was actually doing quite well. But I wanted to get out and see the world. I wanted to experience something beyond four walls of a old school brick and mortar store. So that's how I became interested in that program. Now, you mentioned the WSET. The WSET and the Master of Wine program are administered completely separate, but they do have a connection. And for many that make their way through the WSET program, there's stages within the WSET, and that highest level is what's called the diploma. Now, if you attain that diploma level, and there's a lot of people around the world who have hit that mark, for many, that is then the entry point into the Master of Wine program. Okay, so that is the accreditation that is part of the criteria to get you into the Master of Wine program.
It's required that you accomplish that first.
It's not required.
Okay.
There's exceptions to that, but I believe it's the most commonly taken course.
Okay.
Now the WSET is much more of a memorization exam, and it's understanding classic principles of anything with wine. It could pertain to the vineyard, to winemaking practice, and so on. The Master of Wine program is, to a large extent, it's much more of taking that base information and applying it to certain situations. So it's a bit more of like a problem solving.
Okay.
So the WSET is considered maybe more of a foundational base. The Master of Wine program is taking that base and, for lack of a better term, I'd say thinking more broadly or more laterally and applying it. With the Master of Wine program, there are three parts to passing the program. There's something called the practical, which is 3 days of blind tasting. And generally it's 12 wines per day. You start out first thing in the morning is when you taste, which is when your senses are sharpest. And with the blind tasting, you get a variety of questions. You never know what's going to be asked, but generally speaking, you may get questions like, what are the variety and varieties, place of origin, vintage, method of production, influence of weather, market position. there's a whole laundry list of things, and the questions will be weighted with different point totals. And it's not just a matter of saying Cabernet Sauvignon, Margaux, blah blah blah. That's not what it's all about. It's more about the how you got to the conclusion. So it's more of, okay, here's my starting point, and here's my end point, and here's the journey in which I've got from point A to point B.
And you have to outline that in your answer. That's what they're looking for, that substance in between there.
Correct. So, for instance, the example I used, if you're looking at Margaux and you say that the wine is Cabernet Sauvignon based, they want you to substantiate why. And then, of course, I'm making mention maybe of Merlot or Cabernet Franc, but you need to frame it within the context of the way the question is set. So you go through that for 3 days. And then in the afternoon, there's several sessions of what's called the theory, which is essentially essay writing. And one day would apply to anything in the vineyard, the next day, anything within the winery. There's a business of wine. There's several topics, and each of those play out in the afternoon. And then the third piece is the dissertation.
That's quite a process that you have to go through. And it makes me ask the question on the tasting. 3 days of tasting, do they set it up where you're doing reds one day, whites the next day, and then the third day would be something else? Or how do they set up the tastings, the blinds?
Yeah, generally what happens is day one is whites, day two is red, day three can be anything. Could be fortified, sparkling. You could see red or white again. It could be a mixed bag of things. And I tell you, I think the practical is the one where people have a lot of interest because, you made the mention of the Somm movie. Okay,
Yeah,
I think if I have this right, and I'm not ultra familiar with the MS program, but I believe they have to identify. I believe it's 6 wines, and it's an oral exam. So there's a panel there, and they're asking you questions. That's not what happens in the Master of Wine. The Master of Wine is a written exam, and in this case, it's 36 wines over 3 days.
and when you taste the wines, are you still have some type of time limit to complete those 12 wines?
Yeah, you do, and this is what becomes a pain point for people. I I believe it's 2 hours and 15 minutes for 12 wines. So gives you approximately 10 minutes per wine. And I went through this in a very methodical way. I would spend typically 3 minutes or so analyzing the wine, taking some really quick shorthand notes. And I would take about 7 minutes to actually answer the question. And my hope was I would have about 15 minutes at the end where I could go through and review and make sure things flowed and I didn't have spelling errors or just stupid mistakes.
Sure. So give the audience, the listeners, some idea of, we're talking about this and it sounds difficult. How difficult is it? And what I mean by that is, what's kind of the length of time once you get your diploma, which is also quite a length of time to get your diploma from the WSET, if that's the route you go, saying that's the most common route. Um,
Mhm.
and you say, I want to get into the Master of Wine program. The time from which you enter into the program, and I'm assuming you have to have some type of sponsor or something, to when you actually can take the exam, and then how hard is it to pass the exam on the first attempt?
So, yeah, there are some other steps in terms of entering the program. And I'm not completely up to speed on what those steps are today because they change a bit from year to year. But yes, you do need to have a sponsor. I believe there's a requirement in how much time you've actually spent within the wine industry. There's exceptions to that, but those are taken as a case by case basis. But for me, it was, I'm going to say, many many years, 15 years or so prior, where I tasted routinely. And going back to my original story with this older gentleman who got me started in this business, I believe learning the classics from the beginning was a godsend for me. I think it's something that helped me, and it still helps me to this day, because it gives you a clear reference point, knowing Piemonte and Tuscany and the Rioja and Burgundy and so on. Um, but your question in terms of how many people make it through, the pass rate is insanely low. Look, the program's been around since 1953. There's been about 500 people who have passed over that 70-year spread. The year that I passed, there were four other people in the world who made their way through. I passed in 2002. And the year that I passed, that broke a 4-year drought where no one had passed in North America.
Really?
So, I don't want to discourage people because it's a fantastic program and it's definitely worthwhile, but there's it's not easy. And there are people that can go in, and you certainly need to have a support system around you. Someone who can help you through the process. You need significant time dedication to this. There's a financial side to it as well. And I think for many, and it was certainly the case for me, you have to have the ability to bounce back from setbacks. This is something you just don't cruise through. So I believe the year that I entered the program, if I recall, I believe there were 104 new students that came into the program that year. And of that 104, four of us passed.
Wow. And when you come into the program, there's no set time limit that, okay, you're in, you need to test by a certain time. It's at your pace.
Well, it was more, that was more the case some years ago. That has now been tightened up a bit.
Okay.
So the program has definitely evolved. Uh, Back when I went through the program, there was help along the way. You're assigned a mentor. So there's some MW that you can have some conversation with. But it's all on the student to actually reach out to that MW. So, it falls on the individual. Now, there are more touch points involved in the current program to make sure you're on point. Now, I spent several years as an examiner within the program. So after I had passed, I was an examiner for a number of years, and I still am involved in some of the education programs and all of that. So I'm still involved in the program. And, I can see what a lot of the struggles are for people. And it was certainly the case for me. And the point that you raised, time management is definitely a big part of it. Uh, but it's a lot of practice and it's repetition and knowing those foundational base classics for the tasting is just a godsend.
So you've mentioned that a couple times, the classics. And I have some idea of what I think the classics might be, but for you, a master of wine, what are the classics in wine? You mentioned Tuscany, I'm guessing Burgundy, Bordeaux.
Yeah, yeah, it would be, places like Rhone, Rioja, Ribera del Duero, Priorat. But even in outside of Europe, there's plenty of places that I would say are classic regions now. I mean, something like Marlborough, for instance, in New
Okay.
Zealand.
Yeah.
For many people, hey, that's the hat I'm wearing. Uh, for many people, that's really the standard of what Sauvignon Blanc is today. For others, maybe they would say Sancerre, Pouilly-Fumé, but there are those classic regions outside of Europe as well. I would say Coonawarra would be an example of that. McLaren Vale
Sure.
in Australia. So there's a number of these, but the areas that consistently excel at whatever it is they do are areas that I would say these are classics and you need to know these extremely well. So when I say know them, it doesn't mean just tasting the wines and having the ability to identify. It's also knowing the climate conditions there, how that influences the style of wine, the general winemaking techniques. It goes beyond just tasting and identifying.
Sure. Well, here's a question I want to ask, and I'm sure people are thinking this as they're listening. When you finally passed, what was, I mean, I can only imagine what your reaction was, the excitement, but how did you react? I mean, what was the news? How did you find out?
It was a phone call, and at this time I was still living in Michigan, and this was the year that I passed. It was the only year where I thought I feel extremely confident about the results. I just felt like this was my year. And it's a couple months after the exam is taken when you actually get the results, because the exams, the actual papers, are graded at various places around the world. You don't know who the graders are. I mean, everything is kept very, very private, very quiet. And I received a phone call. And I remember I was in Michigan, many of the houses there have basements. And I was in the basement doing laundry, and the phone rang. And I picked up the phone, and it was one of the persons from London who said, "Bob, I have the good word that you've passed the Master of Wine exam and you've achieved all the criteria." And, Rob, you think I would have been jumping up and down and just happy as hell. It was just colossal relief.
Oh,
I thought, oh my God, it's finally done.
well, good for you. That's awesome. I want to ask, when you get a title like Master of Wine and you have such a great accomplishment in the wine world like that, do doors open? Do you get into, where does that take you? What are the opportunities that one might have or take advantage of with the Master of Wine?
For me, and I'm sure the journey is different for others. For me, I looked at it as a means to shifting from being a small business owner to doing something different. And it was definitely my ticket for that. It provides instant credibility within the wine trade. So there's certainly a benefit there. Um, the fact is, there's a lot of people in the wine trade that really have no clue what a master of wine is.
Yeah.
Oftentimes confuse it with master sommelier. And just so that there's some clarity on that, master sommelier is much more geared towards the food service industry. And many master sommeliers are people that are, very prominent in the wine world because they're in very visible roles. But oftentimes they're tied to high-end restaurants or something in that world. For Master of Wine, you could have people like me who are a retailer. It could be an importer. It could be a winemaker. Uh, the Master of Wine reach, I believe now, is more than 30 countries. Uh, when I passed back in '02, I was the 19th North American to pass. So here it
In the
is,
history of
20.
the program.
Correct, yes. So I was the
Wow.
19th North American. At the present time, I believe there are 50 in North America. So to give you some idea of how that looks, here it is 20, 21 years later, and there's 30, 31 more Masters of Wine in North America.
Yeah, I
And
wonder
it's,
what that means. How do you read that into the wine world? Is wine just getting, to me, I think it is just more popular, more people are more interested into that deep dive into wine.
I think there's been a lot of shifts in the wine world. You have many of the old school traditional countries, you think Spain, Portugal, Italy, France. Portugal, the Portuguese drink a lot of wine. It's something like 50 liters per capita or something. But in many of the countries in Europe, the consumption rate is dropping, and it's dropping rather quick. But the focus is much more on quality versus quantity.
Yeah.
So you have this shift where people are drinking maybe less, but they're drinking better. But now you have a huge influx of people, many of which from Southeast Asia, who have now embraced wine. So go back 25, 30 years ago, they really were not playing in that space a whole lot. So, the overall consumption for wine globally continues to tick up, but how the numbers are dispersed around the world has changed quite drastically.
Okay. Well, I want to ask you, are you still active with the Master of Wine program, the WSET program? Do you teach? Do you lecture? Do you mentor?
Absolutely, all of those. Uh, the mentoring part of it, I currently have 3 students. There's a couple of people that I'm talking to through my YouTube channel who may at some point enter the MW program. And I said, if you're interested, I'll be happy to be your mentor. But I'm still involved in many aspects of it. And that's actually one of the perks of the program. If you stay active in it, and it's encouraged that you stay active, but it's not mandatory. But for me, I look at it as a way to force myself out of the comfort zone, to try to stay current. Because look, wine is a topic that you'll never know everything.
Right.
And you have new regions coming into play, and you have all these factors playing out with climate change and new techniques used in wineries that didn't exist some years ago. And then you reshuffle the deck every year with a new vintage.
And just new winemakers, even at an old, chateau in France, a new winemaker within the family has some new ideas on doing things. And yeah,
Of course, yeah, there's a lot of that going on. So for me, the fact that you can never know everything, I actually find very appealing, because there's always something new and different. And even if someone has an MW after their name, well, they don't know everything.
right.
And you get your head wrapped around that. I think it's actually one of the cool aspects of the wine world. It's like there's always something new and different.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about that as we get into your YouTube channel. And you mentioned your YouTube. Let's go ahead, if you're all right with it. Let's shift to that
Yeah,
and talk
sure.
about your YouTube, because that's where I found you. Several months ago, I found you on YouTube, and I'll get into it in a minute about what kind of drew me to you and what I like about your channel. But I'll let you start by, why YouTube, Master of Wine. You decided to, I'm going to do a YouTube channel. How did this come about?
Well, this is a little bit of a strange journey, but I'm a YouTube addict, and I have been for a number of years. So I love the platform. My plan was at like 2019, I was thinking, I think this could be a good thing. At this point, I lived in Australia for a couple of years. At that point, I had moved back from Australia, and I thought, yeah, I think this could be an interesting space to play in. Yeah, there were a few people doing some things there, and some of the content I think is really good, but I didn't feel it was a saturated segment. So I planned on doing something with YouTube, and then 2020 came around, and I had COVID, and much of 2020 was a write off for me. I was in a bad way, and and then in 2021, I thought, okay, let me get back to doing this. And I'll tell you, Rob, it's a strange thing. It's daunting. It's I'm a little bit of like the old dog trying to learn a new trick.
Yeah.
YouTube's for young people. And I thought, God, can I actually play in this space? And when you start out, you're basically a grain of sand on the beach. And today maybe I'm 2 grains of sand, but that's it.
You're making progress.
Yeah, but it's a long, long road. Uh, but I'll tell you, the part that was so tough for me was actually hitting the publish button for the first time.
Yeah.
I thought,
Just wondering, are you ready, or what's the reaction going to be, or is this good enough? When you couldn't push the button, what was the reason? What was holding you back?
well, first off, it's not good enough.
Yeah.
I mean, your early videos, God, they're awful.
Yeah.
And but at some point, I fear you have to take the leap of faith.
Yeah.
Uh, I think the part of it that was a little bit daunting is you put yourself out there, so you feel very exposed, And I'm thinking, okay, what's the feedback going to be from people that I don't know that could be anywhere around the world? And I've got to say that has been, I think, the most pleasant piece of YouTube. People have been incredibly supportive. I mean, nice comments and a lot of comments. Uh, and I, and you know, I know this is a common thing in today's world, but for me to be sitting here and texting with someone in the U.S., then someone in the U.K., and someone in Malaysia, then someone in Canada, then the U.K., all in one day because they saw an 8-minute video I posted. What a cool thing!
Yeah, very cool. Yeah.
So, so that part of it has been, yeah, I found it really quite exciting. But getting out of the starting block, not easy.
So
And the other is
yeah,
YouTube is complex.
very.
Oh my God, there's so many moving pieces.
Yeah, it's a bit of a game on how how it works and what you have to do to be found, so to speak, so that they'll put your videos where people can find you. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
but
let me ask you this: when you started with the YouTube, obviously you wanted to get into this space, but your thought was, here's what I want my channel to be. What was that? And has it changed? You've been doing this how long now, Bob? Less than a year? Getting close to a year?
no, it's been
8
8 months.
months. Okay.
It
So,
launched in December of 2022.
okay. And at that time, your vision, your thought for the channel, is it been consistent? I'm assuming probably changed a little or tweaked a little or
A bit. My thought was I would like to do something for really two target audiences that I think are very similar to one another. It's people that are in some sort of wine education program, could be the WSET or any number of others, and people who are just interested wine drinkers. They're not necessarily in the wine business, but it's part of their lifestyle. It's something they enjoy. And my thought was, okay, if I can do something to maybe get people to think of things in a different way and try some new wines and just kind of experience more of the full spectrum, well, that would be a win. Um, so that was my thought early on. I don't know if that's really, I didn't go in with some ultra analytical approach, but that was my thought out of the gate.
no, and I see that in your approach and what you're doing in your videos, and that's what I appreciated because I'm kind of the guy you described. I enjoy
Hmm.
wine, and I think in today's world, no matter what it is, I'm big into food, wine, and whiskey. Thus, the name of my podcast. But we all dive in a little deeper into all these things. I always talk about my parents or grandparents when they grew up. They just went to the store and bought whatever ground beef and bought a can of coffee and didn't think much about it. Now, in today's world, we want to know, where did that cow graze, and how are those chickens fed, and where were the coffee beans, and how were they washed, or are they
Yep.
natural, and all this stuff. And I think that also into the wine world, the consumer of wine now, when there's this peak of interest of, hey, I like the way this tastes, we then go, what's the story behind this? And you dive a little deeper and want to learn about, where does it come from, who are the people who make it, how do they make it.
I think you're on to something. I think you're spot on, Rob. For instance, I travel a lot, and sitting on a plane, striking up conversation with some stranger next to me, it's like, where are you from? What do you do for a living? The usual things. And here's someone who tells me, oh, they're a CPA somewhere, and they ask me, what do you do? Oh, I'm in the wine trade. That's all they want to talk about.
Yeah.
So, I think the interest in wine is, well, certainly you have instant access to information that wasn't there not all that many years ago. And the other thing is, if you're into wine, I mean, it's tied to a part of your life that is all about enjoyment.
Yeah.
It's not something that's like, oh my God, I've got to do this again. It's something that's fun, entertaining, and it's like a part of your life that's good.
Yeah.
So I think that may be part of it.
And what I enjoy and appreciate about your channel and the content you're putting out, Bob, is you're going for the average wine person, I think, and you kind of mentioned that. But what I mean by that is, I watch some wine channels, some wine content where, and I see this in Facebook groups that I'm in, some wine Facebook groups where, every bottle that's posted is $100+ a bottle. And,
Mm,
can you get good wine spending a lot of money? Absolutely, you can. But for me, in the world of
yeah.
wine, I want to, the joy of wine for me is to find that bottle that I pay $15 for. But as I'm drinking it, I go, I'd have paid 30 for this. This is that good.
Hmm.
And you do a lot of content where you show us the value in wine at a price point that I think the consumers can appreciate and can afford. And I really like that about your channel.
Oh, well, thanks for that. But that is part of the plan. That is part of my plan. It's you don't need to spend a huge sum of money to drink well. And if you're looking in the right places and going to the right sources, it's actually not all that difficult. But there is a bit of due diligence on the front end.
Sure, sure. Well, what's
Yeah.
the what do you have in your mind any ideas of how you want to take your channel? What's the trajectory of what you want to do in the next year, 2 years, 5 years with the channel?
Well, going into it, my thought was this is a marathon. It's not a sprint, and you need to stay in this long term to get that positive forward momentum. The channel's progressing really well. It's actually, as I mentioned, 2 grains of sand on the beach. That's true. Uh, it's actually one more grain than I expected to have at this point. It's progressing along, but very, from a very, well, you start from zero. Uh, what I would like to see going forward is I can fine tune the videos a bit more, understand more of what the audience is really looking for. Uh, I'm going to do some things that are going to be out of the box. I'm not sure when I'll do this, probably sometime in the fall, but I'm going to do some live streams.
I love that.
And, I'm thinking the first one, I've got a topic that's in mind, and that'll be daunting as well because when you do this, again, you're putting yourself out there. But I'll say on the videos that I've done, when I've done blind tasting, for instance, if I stumble and fall, you're seeing it just as it is. Uh, and I think that's really the way it has to be played. It's just hey, this is the way things went today.
But I think that's a great point, Bob, that you make because somebody like me, I absolutely appreciate that with you and other folks that I see on YouTube who show that on their videos when they don't because to your point earlier, you never know everything about wine. Yeah, you have the title Master of Wine, which is incredible, but you're still not going to nail every wine you blind taste. And I've seen you've done
Right.
some where you've missed and they're shown. But I always enjoy watching you as you talk through after it's been revealed, and you'll talk about markers that you may have missed. I missed that, and I should have picked that up, and here's
Yeah.
why. And you kind of talk us through it, and I like that about what you do.
Well, yeah. Thanks for that. But some of that is actually very much like what happens in the MW exam. This thought is, well, I need to hit the wine spot on. That's not true. You can pass and be wrong. You take a leap of faith at the end and you're wrong. But your thought process leading up to it is correct.
You get credit.
You can, yeah, you can still land in a good place.
Okay, that that
Of
that
course.
that that makes sense, and that to me should be the way it works. Absolutely, you're not going to nail everything.
Right,
Um,
right.
can we jump into some fun wine talk?
Yeah, you pick. Go ahead.
Okay, I want to ask you, you've been in the wine world for a number of years. You've obviously accomplished quite a bit. I'm assuming you have to have a crazy wine story, something that's just been
Ha!
unique or different in the wine world that people hear it and go, that can't be true.
Oh, man. Yeah, I think there's a few that may fit that. Let me make sure it's something that could be appropriate for this space. Uh, I had one. This was back maybe 2005, 2006. I took a trip to South America. I was in Chile. I worked for a large retailer, and we were buying massive amounts of wine from this winery. And I visited the winery, and it was my last stop on the trip. So I was there for whatever, 10 days. This was my last day. And usually on these types of trips, I'll have a driver who is getting me from point A to point B, but he's also my interpreter. So I spend the entire time with this person. And we were at a winery that was about a 3 hour drive from Santiago, and I was flying out that night. And anyway, I had this meeting there, and everything's going fine, but I'm getting short on time, and it's time for me to head out. I've got a 3 hour drive back, and I'm flying out that evening. And the person who owned the winery, and I'm not going to use their name, but the person who owns the winery said, "Look, you can stay. I have a plane. We will fly you to the airport. It's a 20-minute flight. So it's not a 3 hour drive, it's a 20-minute flight." Okay, that sounds fine. So we finish our meeting, and he said, "Okay, now I'm going to take you to the airport." Now, Rob, this is like a small town of a couple hundred people. Like, airport? Really? Well, the airport was a gravel strip. And here's our plane. And it's an old beater, chitty chitty bang bang twin engine prop plane. And the thing looks like a wreck. Great. Get on the plane. And the pilot,
So you got
uh,
on.
well, I had no choice at this point. If I wanted to come home, get on. And so I get on the plane, and the pilot said he wants me to sit next to him in the co pilot seat. Okay. So, you have that belt that goes across your chest and the one across your waist. Well, the one across the waist didn't exist. And it took this guy multiple turns to get this engine started. It finally starts, and half the gauges are just slapping back and forth. Like, this thing is a flying wreck. And there's a few other passengers in the back of the plane. We have this old ratty shower curtain that separates the cockpit from the rest of the plane. And he pulls this thing out onto this gravel runway, and you can hear the gravel popping off the outside of the fuselage as this thing just puts down. And it's fishtailing. But as we're heading down the runway, I'm thinking, God, we are not picking up much speed. I mean, this is just something's not right.
Yeah.
And as we're nearing the end of the runway, the pilot gives me a little nudge with his elbow, like, "Yeah, everything's fine. Everything's fine." I'm thinking, well, the plane is not supposed to take off. The
What?
plane, you're in the Andes. The plane launches off a cliff.
Oh, it doesn't lift, it falls.
It falls. So
Wow.
as we're heading, maybe 2 seconds before we go off, I'm thinking, oh my God, we're going off the cliff. So we do. And if you've been on a roller coaster, you know that point where your stomach kind of like comes up?
Oh, yeah.
That's exactly what this felt like. And, I'm sure we were moving along, and the nose is pointed up. You could hear the engines just screaming. And 20 minutes later, we land in Santiago, go, here you are. So
That would have been good
that,
information to share with you prior to, because, yeah, I can only imagine what you're thinking
oh,
as you're going down that runway.
well, the worst part was for the people in the back of the plane, because I could see what was happening.
Yeah.
They couldn't.
Yeah.
So as
I don't
that
know if that's
plane
good
went
or bad,
off,
though.
well, they're all back there screaming.
Are they really?
So anyway, yeah, that's my crazy wine story.
Wow. Well, let me ask you this. Everybody always has the question, Bob, in the wine world or wherever, what's the next big thing in this sandbox? So, in the world of wine,
Uh,
your opinion, what's the next big thing in wine? Is it a variety? Is it a region? What is it?
so I'll tell you, with this, Rob, if you go back couple decades. If you look at what's happening in the UK, usually a couple years later, it makes its way to the US. A couple years after that, it'll make its way to Australia, for instance. You can find that trend when you look at when Melbeck climbed, when rosé became, in fashion again. For me, I think what's going to happen next is I don't think there's any grape variety that's going to all of a sudden come on the scene and be the be all end all. I don't think there's any region that'll do it. I think it's going to be a collective group of indigenous grape varieties.
Okay.
And it gets back to your point where people would like to know more of where's this coming from? What's the story? Well, if you look at a place like Portugal, for instance, you have approximately 265 registered indigenous grape varieties. Italy has more. And there's other places in Europe that have a good amount of these as well. But if you look at what's happening in many of these wine regions within Europe, in many instances, there has been a conscious effort to bring these grape varieties to be more known.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've been in Italy twice in the last couple of months, and you look at something like Fiano in the south of Italy, or Pecorino from Abruzzo. I'm not talking the cheese. I'm talking the grape variety.
Yeah.
Uh, these are phenomenal wines. And I think collectively, same thing in Portugal, the things that, grape varieties like Baga, fantastic wines. So
And
my
good
feeling
value.
is, oh, they're insane values.
Yeah.
They're insane values. My feeling is indigenous grape varieties will be the next thing that people are searching out. It's the natural progression to really getting very localized and having something that's say has a bit more of a feel of being authentic.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of Italian wines in general. I mean, I think, to your point, the classics are what kind of gets you there. But once you start exploring and you get into some other regions, and you've done a video recently, and I think it's a great one because it's a wine I've been enjoying for a couple of years now, but the Montepulciano de Abruzzo, which I think is a great wine at a great value and doesn't get enough love.
That's a place that I've been to Italy many times, but this was my first time to Abruzzo. And you can get the vibe there of, we're going to reduce the yields, we're going to improve the quality of the fruit in the vineyard. They've embraced, and whether you're a fan of, all the organic, eco-friendly, that's whatever your opinion happens to be on that. But they're using it as something that it helps to improve the overall fruit quality.
Yeah.
And, I think they're doing a great job with that. And it's an area that for years has been undervalued. So to me, that area is just ripe for it. Puglia is another place down in the south,
Yep.
and yeah.
Well, I have a question for you. A lot of people ask this, Bob. Do you have to be born with a good palate, or can you train and develop where you can have a good palate in wine? Or is it a
Wow.
blend of both?
Uh, I think you're probably blessed if you have the ability to discern certain characteristics in wine. I think a lot of it is trained. And, Rob, I think you actually bring up a good point. This, to me, is one of the things in wine that sometimes can be a little muddled. There are elements in a wine that are very tangible: oak, alcohol, acidity, residual sugar. They are what they are. I mean, that's indisputable. Knowing those things and tasting it to better understand that gives you a fantastic framework in terms of just understanding that wine better. Where things get lost is when you get into all the language. And, someone may say, oh, this has a red fruit character. I may say, well, I'll identify it as a cherry fruit character, and you identify it as Bing Cherry. We're all talking the same thing, but we're discussing it with different words. That part of it, I think, becomes muddled and confusing with wine. But if you look at those elements they are what they are, the alcohol, residual sugar, acidity, those types of things, that is where you can really fine tune your palate.
I think that's a great point, and that's probably the better way to ask the question. And those are the things you need to know to have a good palate. Because I think, to your point, Bob, so much of tasting wine is identifying those things and what levels those are that help you kind of, let's just say you're doing a blind, kind of tells you maybe where that wine is from, or you're just trying to figure out what you like and don't like. Because a lot of people might go, let's just say Chardonnay. Chardonnay from a warmer region is going to have a different type of profile than a Chardonnay from a cooler region based on acidity and things like that. And understanding that
Yep.
so you know what you like for your palate is important. Chardonnay's not Chardonnay everywhere.
And Chardonnay is actually the perfect example because Chardonnay is a little bit like the chicken breast of the wine world. You can do all kinds of
Yeah.
things with Chardonnay. And you're right, it could be climate differences in the cellar, oak treatments and malolactic and blah blah. It goes on and on. So yeah, I think that's the place to really hone your skills and improve your palate. Uh, and in my opinion, doing that first with the classics is the way to go. Especially if you're a young person coming into wine, and if you can walk into a store today and you can find an ocean of all these labels that are, you know, odd red blends and things. And, some of these can be fun wines to drink, but knowing the classics gives you that reference
Yeah.
point.
I think that's a great point. Here's a question I have for you. My wife and I have had this discussion a couple of times. And we, like most Americans, I think when you find wine and you get into wine, the first place in the States you want to go is Napa. I mean, and it's a great
Mm.
place to go. And they
Mm.
make some great wines. But as we
Yep.
kind of stay in our journey of wine, we made our way to the old world and found, France and Spain and Italy and places like that. And we've had the discussion a few times, and I'm wondering if you agree it's very difficult, I would think, to go from the old world wine and come to Napa. It's much easier to go from Napa to old world. And I only say that because I think Napa makes great wines, and California in general, some other regions as well, make great wines. But the cost, and I understand the reasons for the cost and kind of how that works and why it is as expensive as it is, but it's just a
Yeah.
difficult thing to do to go from old world to new world to Napa. Do you agree with that?
Uh, I think that's a tough one, and I think that's more on the individual. I mean, for me, I learned the European wines first, and then it was California and Australia and other places outside of Europe. I think it depends where you're from. If you're in Europe and you're drinking wines from a specific country or maybe even just a specific region, your palate becomes calibrated to that place.
Yeah,
Now, with a place like Napa, you know, I mean, I'm heading up to Sonoma after this phone call, but Napa's 4% of the production of California, but it's high profile.
sure.
So if you think California wine, Napa is top of mind. The wines there, and I think the wines are changing, but if we're talking reds, let's say we're talking classic Cabernet Sauvignon, the wines have changed. And you go back some years ago, some degree today you can still find it, but you would find wines that were heavily oaked, very ripe, big extraction. Everything was just amped up. Uh, if you're drinking Bordeaux and that's your thing, yeah, that can be a bit of a jolt. It can be a bit of a jolt. But I think if you're drinking wines from Napa, and all of a sudden now you're going to a place like you're drinking some wines from Santa Steph, boy, that is a massive shift again. So
Yeah.
I think it really depends on the individual. Uh, I'm kind of like soft shoeing around this. I'm not really answering this
No,
question.
and I probably didn't do a good job of the reason we have the opinion we have is because of just the cost to quality ratio. What you can get in some of the old world and some other new world places as well, versus what we were paying and still are paying for some things in Napa, which are great wines. They're just can be a bit expensive. Where when you get into old world, man, you can find you get into Northern Rhone and Southern Rhone, and you get into some of these places, Rioja. I mean, the aged wines you can get out of Rioja for something that's 10 years old and pay $40 for a Reserva. I mean, it's hard to go from that. And our cellar has greatly shifted to so much old world when it used to be so much new world.
You know, Rob, I've been listening to your podcast for the last several days, preparing for this one, and I just happened to listen to the one on Spain yesterday. Uh, I agree with you. You can find insane values in other places around the world of very iconic, classic wines that tick all the boxes in terms of bringing enjoyment. Uh, I think a lot of it has to do with the individual. You know, there are people who Napa Cabernet is their thing and they're happy with it. Well,
Absolutely.
if you're happy with it, that's all that matters. If you want to take the exploration and try new things, and along the way, you're probably going to try some things you just flat out don't like, but you'll find some other things that you really do like. If you find value in that, hey, then it's a win.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
agree. Let me ask you this. There's a wine region in the States that I just love that I don't think gets enough love, enough recognition. Maybe it does, but just not in the world in the circles I'm in, I guess. Um,
hmm
is there a wine or a region or something that you just absolutely love drinking that as you look around the wine communities, you go, man, people aren't drinking this that much, and I don't understand why. I don't get it. Is there a wine that kind of hits like that for you?
Yeah, I think there's a few. You know, for me, I mean, anything from Portugal would be high on the list. And Portugal to me is a strange. It's a strange situation there. Long winemaking history, um, many fantastic values. Every region within that country produces wine. For a small country, I think the country is maybe like the size of Indiana. You know, it's not a huge place, and but very diverse. You get the coastal areas, you get mountainous areas. You know, all different types of soil structure. It's like wow, in a small area, in a concentrated space, there's an incredible amount of diversity, and that's highlighted by the high number of indigenous grape varieties. But the thing I find so odd is it seems like people that are a little bit more wine geeks are dialed in. The trade is certainly dialed in, but the broad market consumer, no. So, you know, I think that's one place that has just incredible potential.
Is that partly due to distribution? I think I read somewhere where, obviously Portugal's been making still wines for a while, but they've recently amped up their distribution of these wines more globally in the last few years.
Yeah, you know, you do see their wines out in, if you go into a decent store, you'll find a good range of it. But I think it's tough for people to work their way through because you know, they're not doing the international grape varieties to any large extent. And it's a little bit of like, well, I'm not sure what I'm buying,
Yeah.
you know, so I think that's an obstacle. Another area that I think is just ripe for an incredible comeback, and this may be a bit of a surprise, but I think Australia is ripe for it.
Oh, really? Comeback, you say?
You know, I can recall back 20, 25 years ago, you walk into a grocery store and there would be a huge section of Australian wine, Shiraz and Cabernet and Chardonnay and, all this sort of thing. But it was all owned by just a handful of companies, and it was mostly commodity brands.
Yeah.
These were things being sold for $10. And then you've got Yellowtail that comes on the scene, and that's the one that's still out there today. And I think that's really dumbed down the whole category. But when I lived there, what an eye opener to visit the smaller estates where, I mean, very artisanal, and they're doing a lot of things with unusual grape varieties. They have a lot of old vine Grenache, which is fantastic, but they're doing things like Gamay and Fiano and a lot of Tempranillo. Who knew?
Yeah.
Uh, but I think Australia has a great story to tell, and I'm seeing signs in the U.S. where this is going to make another comeback. It'll come back, but with a very different look than what it had a few decades ago.
Yeah, I was visiting with a guy in Melbourne a couple weeks ago, and he was telling me to look out for some really great wines coming out of Tasmania.
I've been to Tasmania. Wow. Well, I lived in Melbourne, so Tasmania was less than an hour away. Uh, Very different style for Australia. People oftentimes think, Shiraz, big, extracted. Tasmania is mostly aromatic style wines. It's Riesling and Pinot Noir and
Yeah,
sparkling. Tasmania is pricey, but
some good
love the
stuff.
wines.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The region for me in the States that I think I'm always surprised doesn't get more love, I think it should, is the Finger Lakes. I have really come to enjoy a lot of the wines produced, not just the Rieslings, but a lot of what they do up in that region.
Yeah, I agree. Look, virtually every state has some sort of wine industry now. New York, it's old. They have a long established, Long Island as well.
Sure.
But I think a lot of the wines, they don't get the distribution. A lot of it is sold in a fairly localized manner. Um,
Yeah.
I think I do. I agree with you. I think Finger Lakes make some wonderful wines, but I can't see that world expanding much for them.
So let me ask you this, a question that I like to ask people because we don't like everything, right? That's why the wine world's so big. Is there a particular variety that just doesn't hit for you? Is there a region with a particular style of winemaking that doesn't hit with you? Is there something that you go, yeah, just not a fan of that?
I think the my quick reaction to that would be wines that are over oaked.
Okay.
I think oak, in many cases, just decimates wines.
Yeah.
If the wine has the structure for it, absolutely, it can be something that just heightens the experience. But I think oak oftentimes is overused, and when it is overused, it dries out the fruit. And especially as that wine ages, the wine will fall apart and it just becomes dominated by that oak character. So I'm not a fan of that. And the next one I'll mention, this one may be kind of unpopular to say because it's trendy right now. I am not a fan of Pet Nat.
Thank you. Okay.
Oh,
My wife and I have tried several bottles and I'm going, I don't get it. What am I missing? But okay, good.
well,
It
you and I
doesn't
are on the
shock
same
me.
page.
Yeah.
Oh, I've tried several and I just say, I don't understand what the appeal is.
Okay. We're aligned there for sure, Bob. I want to talk to you about as a guy who was into wine, and it took me a while to get into wine, but when I got into wine, I'm a dude, right? It's got to be red wine. That's the wine for men, and white wine
Yeah.
is that's the ladies' wine. That's what they drink. Uh, Over my journey in the last 15 years, I have shifted quite a bit, and I'm humble enough to say I absolutely love white wine, but I still see a lot of my friends and guys in general at bars. You can't go into a bar and what are you doing ordering a white wine? dude, you're a dude, order a red wine. And I think they missed the point of how good white wine is and how appropriate it is, especially this time of year in the summertime. I don't want a big glass of red.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on white wine?
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
I'll tell you, if I go back 20, 30 years ago, I would say 90% of what I drank was red. Now it's maybe 60-40 red over white. Uh, Rob, I hate to say it, but I think maybe part of it's a function of age,
Okay. Okay.
you know? And the white wines that I drink, generally they're no oak style or light oak, but I'm drinking things like Pinot Bianco from Alto Adige, love Chablis, Loire whites, Puy Fumé, Sancerre,
Yeah.
Manitou Salon, all those things I absolutely love. I love Clare Valley Riesling.
Okay.
That bone dry lemon lime thing going on. I love that. I think part of it I do think part of it is age. And for me personally, I think part of it is my diet has changed.
Yeah.
I'm eating, for instance, I take trips to Malaysia on a regular basis. And when I'm there, I'll tell you, oh my God, Alsatian wines or Clare Valley Riesling, love it. So I think part of it may be what you're eating as well.
I agree with that because I'm a big seafood guy, and not that you have to have white wine with seafood, but it does tend to go with a lot of the dishes I have. And
Mm.
one that I've been just absolutely enjoying recently has been Albarino. I've really been enjoying Albarino.
Yep, sign me up. I'm there with you.
Yeah. Let me,
Yeah.
I want to end by asking you your opinion. And I think I know the answer. I think most guys like you and gals like you enjoy aged wine, but I know it's kind of a lot of people think, or a lot of people may have the opinion that an aged wine is just a better wine. And I don't know
Mm,
if that's necessarily the answer. It's a different wine. It's evolved, it's changed. And the profile, the characteristics of that wine could be something that you really enjoy. But I also know wine people who are big into wine who it's not a profile that they enjoy. They prefer the freshness, the fruit
right.
a little bit more. So, what are your thoughts on aged
Yeah.
wine? Where do you fall?
Well, it's funny because actually tomorrow I'm going to a dinner party and I'm opening this. It's a
Wow.
97 Lafite Rothschild. Uh, but I'll say this: I think with aged wine, there's this mystery around it, where there's this romanticized image. It's older, it's better, it's developed into something. It's phenomenal. The truth is, very, very few wines improve with age. And I'm talking, if you look at what's produced in volume, I would say it's maybe 1%. Okay. And when I say improve, what I mean by that is when you try the wine when it's first released, let's say you had it at 10 years, 20 years, 30, the wine actually develops into something that has more character to it. It becomes more harmonious, and there's just something there that's more appealing. That's a very tiny segment of wine. There is a larger segment that can maintain itself for a number of years, but doesn't necessarily improve.
Yeah.
Then there's a very large mass of wines. I'm talking 90% ish that will go into decline after just a few years. And they're wines where they're fresh, they're bright. I mentioned something like the Sancerre, the Alto Adige, Pinot Bianco. The appeal is all in the youth. The wines are fresh, bright, clean, primary fruit. When that's lost, it's game over. It's like if you had an apple and you cut it in half and sit it on the counter all night. Next day, it's kind of brown, doesn't really taste.
Yep.
That's what happens to a lot of
Yeah,
wines,
and I think of when you describe it like that, not always, but a lot of times Beaujolais would be something that I'm going to drink, right away.
except for some of the
Yeah, that's
crus.
why I say not always, but
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. But
that's the thing. There's always
there's
exceptions.
always exceptions. Bob, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed having you on today. Thanks for coming on the podcast and having a conversation with us.
Rob, I've enjoyed it. Tell you, you do a fantastic job with this. There is not enough O's in the word smooth to describe you. So
Wow, that's very kind of you.
no, you do a fine job.
Well, you with the knowledge you have and everything that you've experienced and been through in the world of wine, I'd love to have you back on in the future. We'll find some other topics and maybe do this again.
You know, I'd love to. And the topic I'd like to hit on is wine and the point system.
Oh, great conversation. I'd love to have that with you because um, well. Anyway, that'll be a tease for another episode with you, Bob.
I have very strong opinions on this.
Sweet. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey. And until our next episode, enjoy your next pour.